Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to the third meeting in 2013 of the Local Government and Regeneration Committee. As usual, can I ask everyone to ensure they have switched off mobile phones and other electronic equipment, please. I have apologies from Margaret Mitchell. I welcome Jamie McGregor to the meeting, who is substituting for her. Welcome, Jamie. We're glad to have you. Agenda item 1 is decision on taking business in private. Can I ask that we agree to take agenda item 4 in private? Are we all agreed? Thank you very much. Agenda item 2, subordinate legislation. We're considering 3 negative instruments today. The Local Government Pension Scheme Miscellaneous Amendment Scotland Regulations 2012, that's SSI 2012/347, the Non-Domestic Rate Scotland No. 2 Order 2012, SSI 2012/352, and the Non-Domestic Rates Levying Scotland No. 3 Regulations 2012, SSI 2012/353. Members have a note from the clerk setting out the purpose of each instrument. The Subordinate Legislation Committee has only drawn the final instrument, number 353, to our attention in relation to a drafting error. However, the Scottish Government has undertaken to correct this error. Do members have any comments to make on any of the instruments? No. Are members content not to make any recommendations on any of these instruments? Thank you very much. Agenda item 3 is Public Services Reform and Local Government Strand 3, Developing New Ways of Delivering Services. We're having an oral evidence session today on Strand 3 of the Public Service Reform Inquiry, which is looking at developing new ways of delivering services. This is the first evidence session on this inquiry, and today we are taking the opportunity to hear the views of 2 eminent witnesses, both of whom have had distinguished careers in the public service. I'm very pleased to welcome Sir John Arbuthnot, President of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and Robert Black, former Auditor General of Scotland. Welcome to you, gentlemen. I wonder if you want to make any brief opening remarks. Sir John.
Chair, yes. Could I first of all apologise, thanking your officials for accepting the paper from the Royal Society, which was a little late, a day late. But I have to point out that these advice papers from the Royal Society involve the input from a number of fellows, and not all of them are as switched on to timescales as others. So thank you for accepting that. The second thing was to ask your advice, Chair. Essentially, I would like to comment in 2 ways. One was to summarise the main headline issues that were discussed at the RSC advice group. And the second was, if it's of any value, to bring you up to date and to tell you a little bit about how the work that I did in the west of Scotland, which has now branched out beyond the Clyde Valley, but started as the Clyde Valley Review and deals with the matters pertinent to this committee, might be of interest to you. I'm happy to do both of these things in the order that you want.
Just do as you wish, Sir John. Please.
The brief advice paper from the Royal Society highlights a number of issues. The first was that it was the view of the group that the request for evidence didn't really deal with the question of outcomes, but they emphasised that outcomes are extremely important. And of course, cost reduction is one of the major challenges. But we do have to bear in mind what any reformed delivery services actually do deliver in form of outcomes for the people of our communities. The importance of demographic trends is mentioned. The importance of fully exploiting the digital technology that is available to us. And I just informed the committee that the Royal Society of Edinburgh has now taken the decision to go into another phase of that called Reaping the Benefits of Digital Scotland. And it does, the paper does deal with the issue of the extent to which digital is available and it is taken up, because the delivery of services in the future is going to depend on the use of digital technology. The challenge of achieving partnerships which I will deal with in more detail when I tell you about my interactions with a number of local authorities in the West. Implementation of shared agreements once you've got them, which raise considerable logistical and political issues. Alternative delivery mechanisms don't just mean shared services, they involve also the third sector, the charities and volunteers. Large-scale savings do require really quite brave decisions to be taken by senior officers and at the political level. And we also have to look at the question of whether Scotland does still require to have 32 local authorities. Eventually, that will raise its head, and did raise with me its head when I chaired the Commission in 2006 for the Parliament on putting citizens first, when we actually looked at the 32 local authorities and their boundaries and how they sat with the electoral boundaries for the Parliament. Workforce planning is another thing which is mentioned. And I think the last thing I would mention is community planning partnerships, because if you're delivering shared services, particularly in relation to joint action between local authorities and health boards, then community planning partnerships are going to be essential in achieving what we want to achieve for services for older people. So, Chair, that was my introductory statement.
Thank you very much. Mr. Black.
Thank you, Convener. I mean, could I just say where I'm coming from this morning? I retired last summer, and of course, as the Auditor General for Scotland, I had really a very unique and somewhat privileged insight into how government works in Scotland. So I did think once I retired that perhaps I should try and pull some of these thoughts together, which I've been doing. The first point to say is that, and just place on the record, is that I've had no discussions with Audit Scotland about this, or anyone in Audit Scotland. I've stayed away from their job completely. So the comments and the opinions I'm offering are entirely my own. The second thing to say is, why am I doing this when I've retired? I sometimes ask myself this. But the serious answer to my own question is that I am passionately interested in the good of Scotland. And as part of that, from my background, the good government of Scotland. And as I attempt to capture in my note for you, I think we do a lot of things very well in Scotland. I think the quality of government is good. Certainly, and I've said this in platforms, standards of probity and legality are very good indeed, and financial stewardship is very good. But that doesn't mean we can't get better. And I do think, personally, I haven't put this in the note, but I've been writing about this somewhere else, I do think that in many ways, the future could well lie with small government. That's not a point about the independence thing. The future could well lie with small government, because so many of the big challenges that we are facing in society are challenges to do with systems and the organisation of society. And you look at centralised states, and you can see that they're having difficulty in coming to terms with some of that. Whereas I think we do some things really well in Scotland. We connect well through partnerships and through the relationship between government, local government, health bodies and the voluntary sector, through the work of this Parliament, which it does when it's taking evidence in all sorts of ways as part of its inquiries and also looking at proposed legislation. So we do lots of things well, but that's not to say we can't get better. And I've drawn a phrase from a book I read many years ago. I gave up reading management textbooks about 15 years ago because I thought, I've read all of this stuff now. But there was a book that came out, From Good to Great, by Jim Collins. And it talks about how in organisations, the good can be the enemy of becoming great. So my starting point is to ask some constructive challenges around are we doing enough to consider openly the hard choices that are ahead for us in Scotland? And are our systems of government and organisation of the public sector really equipped to seize the opportunities which are out there? There are huge challenges, and I think quite often people get bowed down by the challenges of finance, the ageing population and so on, global warming. But there are great opportunities, but they will require a bit of courage and some real energy behind them if we're going to move forward. So what I've done in the note, Convener, is try and capture under 10 headings just some of the issues which I think are really very important. It's no more than a summary note. It's not a long dissertation, which I could have written, and that means that at points in it, I don't do adequate justice to some of the really good things that are going on in Scotland, of which I'm aware, but nevertheless, it's an attempt to capture just some of my thoughts from years of working in the public sector on what's around. I guess that if you look at the 10 headings that I've mentioned there, I would kind of tend to group them into 3. There's the context, which is the serious pressure on public services which are out there. That's both financial, which we all know about, but also what you would call the supply side, the delivery side. You know, the backlogs in maintenance and repair, the implications of the ageing population, waste management. Some of the things I haven't mentioned in there. There are still issues around for equal pay and so on. So it's to make sure that we keep that in mind. And also related to pressures, you know, the changes in the expectation of society and citizens as to what government should do and how services should be delivered. So it's that category of issue. The second category of issues are around, I suppose, it's systems thinking and new models of service delivery, which has got significant implications for things like preventative spending and how we do partnership working and how we do commissioning and contracting of services. And then I push the boat out a little bit towards the end of the paper and suggest that we need to think seriously about the arrangements we have for challenging and supporting improvements in productivity and performance. What are the options for taking that forward? And I venture one suggestion in there about how we might do it, which is the idea of a commission on resources and performance. But there will be other ideas. But the central question is, how are we going to challenge and incentivize improvements in productivity and performance? How are we going to ensure that, in a sense, we hold the feet to the fire of public bodies in Scotland to improve productivity and performance? Because that is going to be absolutely essential given the financial challenges we're facing. And then finally, I think there are some really significant issues and opportunities around how we actually share best practice and learning, not only amongst the leaders in public service. The Permanent Secretary leads the Leadership Forum in Government, which is an excellent initiative, but also amongst the wider range of professionals and also the practitioners and the people out there who are delivering services on the ground. And I suggest we need to do some more around that. And perhaps also, if I may be as bold to suggest this, find a way of helping politicians, both in this Parliament and locally, to have a good appreciation of the exciting opportunities of information and celebrating that and finding ways of learning from it and translating that innovation into other parts of the public sector.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we're going to come back to the submissions that you have made. Stuart Stevenson is absolutely desperate to come in here.
It was just to pick up on one specific thing. Dr. Black talked about small government, and I'm absolutely with him. Scotland has 33.2 elected politicians per 100,000 population. England is 42, France, Germany are 70, 80, Greece is 660. We're actually the lowest number in Europe. And these numbers are approximate, so I'm not going to be held too much to account for them, and I did the numbers quite a long time ago. Is that good because we're getting so much out of a rather smaller number of politicians? Or, if we really want small government that's connecting to communities, should we have more?
I think that's an entirely reasonable question. It's not my special subject, but that never stops me from offering a thought or two. The narrow answer is that it depends what one thinks the role of the politician is at different levels. And clearly it's vitally important that there is a democratically elected tier of people from the community who represent that community and understand its needs and issues. There is also a need for a tier at the level of the Scottish Parliament, which can do the strategic stuff, I think, better than anywhere else. And I think we've been able to demonstrate that in the first 10 to 12 years of devolution. There is, however, a related point, which is rather to ally around your question, for which I apologise, which is how we actually get a good relationship at two levels between politicians who are working more at the centre, such as yourselves, and what is really happening out there in the local communities. Now, all politicians, by virtue of their election, tend to be well connected into local communities, but do people in the Parliament have a really good opportunity to understand what is happening in the modern health service? I wrote a paper quite recently on which this is something like a summary, and I just listed the things that go on in a large teaching hospital. Hugely complex business, and therefore there was the issue of trying to get a connect between the elected representatives and what is truly happening out there in the community. And secondly, there was the perennial problem that's been around for my entire professional life, which is how one gets the business community and the voluntary sector well connected into government. And I think that problem has not eased over the years. I think it's better, a lot better than it was with the voluntary sector, but I still think there's a way to go in terms of the business community's engagement with the Parliament, despite all the good initiatives which have been undertaken.
Thank you very much.
Could I add
Sir John, yes, of
a
course.
bit to that, because I have a little bit of a thing about this as well, actually. When we were doing the commission on putting citizens first, the real purpose of that was to respond to the fact that the number of MPs, Westminster MPs, had been reduced in Scotland, and what was going to happen to the number of MSPs in the Scottish Parliament. And I won't go into all the details of that. It was a fascinating piece of work that we did. But what did strike me was that at that time, and this is historic and retrospective, and it's not nearly so, I think, the case now, quite a lot of tension between constituency MSPs and regional MSPs. And one of the ideas which we put forward at that time was that if the regional MSPs took a more regional interest in strategic issues to do with their region, and there are many, we might actually get, we might get a bigger bang for our bucks. But there was definitely a tendency for regional MSPs to want to become constituency MSPs, no problem about that. So there was a bit of tension about who did what at that stage. I'm not absolutely sure what the situation is now. Just to follow up one point that Bob made, when I was chair of the NHS board in NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, which is a huge area of undertaking many potentially controversial issues, I can say that when these issues come to a head and before, there's absolutely no doubt that local elected local government representatives and MSPs really get stuck in to the issues. And that was a necessary part of that process and eventually led to the way in which we handled it. So that degree of interest and focus by local MSPs and local elected local government representatives is absolutely crucial. Whether we've got the right number, I wouldn't comment.
Thank you for that. I wonder, gentlemen, if you could maybe give us your opinion about the progress that you think has been made in terms of public sector reform since local government reorganisation in 1996. Obviously, the move is on to community planning partnerships, and Dr. Black has already mentioned that there is much more space for the voluntary sector in terms of involvement, but not so much for the business sector. Maybe you could touch a little more upon that as well, if you could, please.
My most informed experience of that, what you have just laid out, is in fact the work that I did on the Clyde Valley Review, and I think it's important just very briefly to remember how that happened. I was asked at the very beginning of 2009 to undertake this review, which involved 8 of the local authorities in the west of Scotland. and was responsible. That spend was probably more than 30% of the spend in public services in Scotland. I think it was a really quite heroic step by these 8 leaders to come together and say, we would like someone to chair this, looking at what is likely to come down the track. And this was very early in the process of the realisation of the extent of the cuts that were to come. But these 8 leaders did get together, did agree that I would chair that. Each of them made available some of their really best qualified young people to help. There were issues about the gathering of information, which actually emerged as one of the most challenging things, and that the data was not standardised. The data between different areas was quite difficult, and Bob would know a lot more about that than I did. And we did encounter problems. But I think at this stage, what I'd point out is that they stuck with that over the year. There was only one occasion close to the beginning of the proceedings when I was sitting with the 8 leaders, and one of them made a suggestion about the issue of trust. And I said, well, if you are not prepared to trust each other and to trust me, then I will leave the room now. But they did. They took that point, they responded to it, and they all stuck it out. Now, later on today, I'll tell you where we've got to now, because one of the problems, I think, with that exercise, and I think it's possibly important, Chairman, for this committee, is it came almost as soon as Alistair Darling at that time had made his autumn statement, just about 3 months after that. And in a way, it was too early in the political process to have as much of an impact as it could have had, because there was then a whole series of elections to take place across the UK and across Scotland, locally and nationally. And a lot of the things could not possibly fall into place until local authorities were better focused on what the outcome of these elections were. So there was a gap between the conclusions and the drawing up of a roadmap and then the implementation of that roadmap. And I'll tell you what has actually come out of that at the end of the day. I think that's a useful reflection, Chair.
Dr. Black.
A few thoughts. It's such a big topic. Again, a qualification, if I may make it at the beginning, Convener. I'm no longer in touch and up to speed with what's happening. Change happens so quickly in Scotland. Therefore, I wouldn't presume to comment authoritatively on any of the issues which are currently around. But just a few thoughts around this. One is that we've got to bear in mind that the first decade or so of devolution was great for the public sector because of the real growth that was built in, 5% a year, year on year, right through the period. So there was a lot of growth in there. And that allowed a lot of things to be done, including some very basic factors like looking at the terms and conditions of staff and so on. If I had one criticism with the benefit of hindsight, which auditors always enjoy, it is that perhaps we could have done more to think about service redesign during those years of growth. And I think we're struggling with that now. It's true in terms of, let's say, redesigning aspects of the health service that you need to invest up front to generate the benefits later down. It's certainly true in a lot of preventative spending that you need upfront investment to redesign the services before you move on. And I think it's fair to say, John, it's not least it's true in relation to shared services, where one of the barriers to lift off for shared service agreements is the need to invest upfront and move forward together. John is much more expert than I in the detail of shared services, but there are one or two factors in there that maybe just worth reflecting on. Local authorities in particular are all different stages in terms of shared services. And I was struck by the fact that one of the problems that was around the practical level was that if Authority A is making moves within its own responsibility to introduce new ways of working, and let's say it signs up to contracts and IT or whatever, and then somewhat later in the day there's a proposal for a shared service initiative that involves several entities coming together, then that particular organisation may have banked some of the savings it was anticipating, and therefore the potential benefits aren't there further down the road. Now, I give you that as an example of perhaps the fact that we could have moved earlier on some of the strategic planning around these things, rather than having to kind of work our way through that in retrospect. I think that has been a real issue. A second issue I would touch on is, again, it's an area that John is very expert in, is the redesign of the health services in Scotland, where I think there are some really significant issues in there in terms of designing a health service that is going to be truly fit for purpose for the future that lies ahead of us, both in terms of coping with the ageing population, exploiting the benefits of new technology, and driving up performance. And there have been 2 or 3 attempts over the years to try and do some of that stuff, but it's been quite difficult. This is auditor speak. I'm talking about the glass half empty. It is also half full. There have been a lot of great initiatives going on in Scotland, a lot of them at the local level, through good local leadership, partnerships between Stirling and Clackmannan Council, between East and Middle Lothian, all sorts of things going on. Some really good work, for example, in benchmarking going on at the moment, led by Solace with the Improvement Service, which I think is really promising. But we've got to recognise that, celebrate it, and say, right, how do we exploit that for the future? I'll stop there. I could go on at great length, but
thank you.
3 points.
I've got 2 supplementaries here. Stuart McMillan and then Jamie McGregor, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. So, John, you mentioned a few moments ago, it was a phrase of it's ahead of its time in terms of the review that took place, and you focused upon obviously the various elections that were taking place. Now that those elections are over, and the next batch of elections are, European elections, obviously 2014, as well as the referendum, but then the next other elections after that. Would you say that that this period of time that we now have is maybe a bit more? There's maybe a bit more space for those who actually have left the process to potentially come back in. And for the process to be reinvigorated, to have a bit more focus once again?
I would like to think that, because a great deal of background work has now been done since the beginning of 2010, and people, I think Bob has exemplified where there's really a lot more knowledge now, thanks to Audit Scotland to a large extent, on where the potential actually is, and the health service has come up with some really quite dramatic improvements and proposed changes. But we do still have ahead of us a period of uncertainty leading up to the 2014 and the referendum, and then we have another set of elections after that. If you asked me to look at in a crystal ball, I would say that I think a lot of work is now being done by the health service, by local authorities, by the various groupings that bring together the administrative heads and the elected heads of these bodies. I think they're pretty well aware of the direction of travel, but I think it will take until 2015, 2016 before we actually see some more dramatic change. That's just my gut feeling. We have seen one really major change which I've been associated a bit with in the background, and that is the creation of the joint police and fire authorities. And that's a very bold step, and I think we will learn from that. But I think it's happened. I think the government has taken the steps to make it happen. And I think that's the beginning of really quite major public reform, public service reform in Scotland. But I just have this feeling that there's still a period when we're going to have to resolve the outstanding political issues before it really moves ahead. But it doesn't mean that nothing is happening, if you get what I'm saying.
My question, in fact, is about productivity and performance. Is it right to bring that in at this point?
Just go ahead.
Right, okay. You note, Sir Robert, that competition and market testing have played little role in incentivising productivity improvement across Scotland's public services. And I very much remember once listening to a Highland Council meeting when a man stood up talking about recycling and shouted, "No targets without markets." And it had a big effect on me, that, when he said that. So, what role do you see alternative business models playing? And also, you talk about, in Australia, for example, there is a productivity commission at arm's length from government, which you seem to like the sound of. Would you like to sort of enlarge on that a little bit and say also, for example, the political concerns of people who think politically that privatising public services is wrong, getting in the way of good outcomes?
A great deal in that question. If I could start at the end and work backwards, I think it is very important not to attach, I'm sure so you weren't implying this, overly simplistic labels to privatisation versus public versus the voluntary sector. I think there were some really important issues around thinking through very carefully with good evidence what is the best configuration for the delivery of any public service. Maybe, for example, we can look just across the M8 there at Glasgow at some of the interesting developments that have taken place there in terms of partnership working with the private sector, some interesting contracts there, and the use of arm's length organisations and so on. So there's a huge richness and diversity of what's going on over there. I guess pretty fundamental to my concern is we actually monitor the standards and quality of public services of Scotland pretty well. And we can see the benefits of that in the quality of many of the public services. We don't look nearly so hard at the costs. I am personally a great supporter of the Scotland Performs framework. I think it's a clear statement from government about the vision of what they're trying to achieve as a government in the longer term, and that is cascaded through the single outcome agreements, which are being progressively refined and improved, I think quite effectively. So that gives a clear statement of the ambition. But when you then start looking at things like, well, which activities are going to contribute to those outcomes, and how much do they cost, and what's the volume of activity, we're still a long way off the pace in terms of the quality of data that's available. Given the financial scenario that we're facing and the pressures from the ageing population and so on, we do, I think, quite urgently need to get a much better handle on cost, activity, productivity, and the contribution to outcomes. The Finance Committee does a great job, as does the Public Audit Committee, but it really requires expertise in those areas and sticking with the issues, doing some really good analysis around that sort of area to inform policy choices in this Parliament and elsewhere. And I think the Parliament would benefit hugely from having more of that. I'd heard a bit about the Australian Productivity Commission over a number of years. I thought, you know, perhaps we need some kind of idea of what a model might look like. And it is a really interesting model. It was set up not that long ago, I think it was early in the 1990s, by the Australian government, with the support of the OECD, incidentally, to try and drive forward the issues of productivity and quality in public services, and actually in the economy as a whole. And it's done some really interesting work. The nearest parallel we probably have in Scotland to this are a combination of the work which Audit Scotland does. But Audit Scotland is an audit organisation. It's looking retrospectively. It never comments on policy. It focuses on providing a service to the Public Audit Committee and the Accounts Commission, which is quite different from doing the policy options appraisal, hard numbers, which I think is needed. And of course, the opportunity to engage with some of the current issues is much more difficult as a result of that. So there's all the work that Audit Scotland does. And then another part of the public sector, which I mentioned briefly in my note, where I think has been really great progress, actually, is in the water industry. Now, whether or not one considers that Scottish Water should be privatised or not, which is back to my starting point, is neither here nor there. You've got to look at the business systems that are in there to see if they're delivering the results. And there's no doubt that Scottish Water, by doing some really rigorous benchmarking over 10 years, has driven its costs down and its productivity up enormously. But an essential ingredient of that was the external challenge that came from the Water Industry Commission with its team of economists, which frankly engaged in an evidence-based challenge to Scottish Water to drive its improvement, and that worked. So John mentioned the Scottish Police Service, and may I just take a punt on that? We will create a single Scottish Police Service across the whole of Scotland. We will have an inspectorate function which will be highly professionalised, which will look at the quality of what's happening in there in terms of service delivery. But are there not issues around, in the longer term, once the whole system is settled down, looking at the cost-quality equation and looking at whether or not the police service is as productive as it should be, given it's a single provider across the whole of Scotland? Comparing it as we have compared Scottish Water with some of the English police services. I'm simply using that as an illustrative example of what might be possible in Scotland. So if we're thinking a bit boldly, I do think that we need to consider creating that kind of capacity somewhere in Scotland.
Sir John, do you want to add anything?
Because I think this is a hugely significant point. If we just take the issue of the demographic changes and the position with regard to care of the elderly, both by the health service and by local authorities, I applaud that the Scottish Government's moves towards integration, and I've made input, significant input in terms of some work that I did on that. If we actually look at, and the consultation is out, the consultation results we haven't seen yet, but I look forward to seeing that. But if you look at some of the things that are already being done in a pilot mode, we have an initiative on integrated resource frameworks. Now, these integrated resource frameworks look at the efficiency and the operation of individual practices within the health service in different areas of Scotland. We have really good data now on the way in which that money is spent. We also know what the costs are in relation to looking after older people in acute care hospitals. And I think there's now an acceptance that that is not the best environment for many of these people to be accommodated in. We should be moving that service towards delivery in the community and in the home. That means the way the health service work with local authorities is going to have to change. But a rough off the top of the head figure in terms of savings that might be made, or at least a redistribution of money that might be made for other purposes, something like £3 billion is tied up in people being in acute hospital care when they don't really need to be there. That's the most expensive part of the delivery of the health service in these hospitals. So I think we're beginning to be able to put these pieces of the jigsaw together, the way in which the money is spent, what is the most efficient way of doing that, the way in which we deliver the care and what the costs of that are. When it comes to the private versus public sector involvement, I think we already have actually quite a mixed economy, particularly in commissioning of services. And one of the areas of the Clyde Valley work which has actually stuck and is working is the creation of a health and social care collaborative in the west of Scotland. They've made major changes in the way in which they commission childcare and foster care. These changes in mode of delivery are supported by the Scottish Government, and they are more efficient and they are saving money. They're also doing the same for adult services along with Scottish XL, and the potential for telehealth and telecare is being piloted by that group. 7 authorities working with the 7 authorities, including 3 of the Ayrshire authorities, 2 health boards, have attracted major investment from Europe to pilot an extension of telehealth and telecare. That will have both a quality of delivery and a productivity aspect to it. And of course, the companies involved in supplying that will be integral to it. So we really, I hope, are moving towards an acceptance of a more mixed economy.
Okay. Thank you, Jamie. John Pentland, you had a supplementary there?
Yeah. So, John, you mentioned that the single police force was perhaps a step forward, and in your submission you mentioned that Scotland needs 32 local authorities. Do you think that there are too many local authorities, or do you think they could be streamlined and take us back to, post 1997 when the unit authorities come in?
It's not possible to say that is something at the moment which should be done or should not be done. I do, however, believe that it's now, 30 years since we looked seriously at local authorities. The work that Bob has described on the knowledge of where we are in relation to the efficiency and funding and use of funds in an accounting sense really at least should raise the question of, is that the best organisational structure for Scotland into the future? And I think that's a question that should now be seriously looked at. But again, I think that's an intensely political issue and is probably not going to happen very soon. But I do think it's now time that we critically assess that. And local authorities are beginning to work together more as consortia, and there's a huge amount of experience coming out of the various initiatives to work together, which I think would inform a review of that. So I think a review is timely.
A brief supplementary here from John Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. The issue that I take this back to is Stuart Stevenson's opening question in terms of democratic accountability, in terms of numbers. If we are throwing into the mix in this debate about the possibility of local government reorganisation, then how does democratic accountability fit into that process? Because we talk about shared services, we should talk about shared delivery. At the end of the day, those services are to be delivered on behalf of the citizens of these areas. How do we get the balance right in terms of, do we go for smaller local authorities, that are smaller number of local authorities and more shared services? Or do we go for a larger number of local authorities, go back to the old borough council days, but tied into that the view of shared services, maybe on a regional basis, such as the Clyde Valley review, or it's one of the papers that suggested from yourselves that we go to look at some of the services that could be delivered at a national level and that local authorities then fit into that process.
John, do you want to know whether Bob wants to go first?
Yes, thank you. If I may come back to the question in a slightly roundabout way. I mean, I'll make a very simple statement. I think we should park the issue of the number of local authorities for the moment.
Yes.
For two reasons. Firstly, there was a lot of service redesign and change going on in Scotland at the moment. And secondly, I don't detect any appetite to look at this seriously. It's really important to recognise, as I think John has eloquently described, and I've tried to as well, there was a lot of really interesting things going on out there in the public services. Lots of local leadership initiatives which are thinking through new ways of service delivery and so on. I think we've got to let some of that mature before we come back to the issue of structures. I think related to that, there's another very simple concept, which is that merging may be difficult, but it's actually easier to do than breaking up. This is the voice of experience, because I was involved in the dismantling of Tayside Regional Council, which was hugely expensive and disruptive. in the 1990s are hugely expensive and disruptive, and none of us would want to go through that again. But living in a world where, with encouragement and support, public sector bodies, and it's not just local authorities, are encouraged to do more and more together and more joining up, I think is the way forward. It will lead to diversity and difference across Scotland about how public service is organised. Perhaps we should celebrate that and never reach the point, and I'm sure Mr Wilson isn't suggesting this, that we become overly focused on a solution for all parts of Scotland. Yeah. I think we should let some of these initiatives evolve and develop, see how, for example, the partnerships are developing in Highland between the Health Board and the Council. Really interesting things go on there, and John has described some of the ones. Let some of this evolve and develop, but let's find ways of really tapping into and understanding what is really happening on the ground. Are we really getting the quality improvements and the efficiencies that we require, and can we learn from that and get some energy and drive behind rolling these things out in other parts of Scotland. If I may make one final point, just on shared services, I just wanted to name one particular issue, which is really an interesting one, which is NHS National Services Scotland has made great strides over the last number of years now in putting together national services for the health service. It's easier to do in the health service because the health service has got a relatively straightforward framework of accountability, and all health boards are basically in the same business. And they made enormous strides there. I welcome the fact that the Scottish Government is now proposing that there should be an order coming forward which would enable NHS National Services to work with local authorities on some of these back office functions. Really interesting development, I think, because NHS National Service has got lots of experience in it. Let's encourage and support that and find ways of monitoring how well that is going and learn from it fast and roll it out elsewhere if it's successful.
I don't want to get too bogged down on changes to local authority numbers. A very brief supplementary, Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Convener. I was going to intend to bring in these questions in later, but I think it's actually very apt now after what Robert Black has just said. Just in terms of the going forward, I mean, are there any good any examples of positive examples as well as negative examples, both certainly within the UK and also outside of the UK that we should certainly look at to try to learn from?
You're asking about examples that have come out from the work we've already done?
In terms of whether it's shared services or in terms of numbers of local authorities or better working together, better practices, etc.
I don't want to stir up the local the discussion of local democracy again, Chair, but I do. One of the things I learned in the time that I worked with these 8 local authorities was that it's absolutely essential that the people in the local areas and really quite small local areas within these local authorities have to have elected representatives who are accountable to them and who actually care about the quality of the service that's being delivered locally. If you get into a mega jigsaw puzzle mode where you think that's just what we're going to do there, we will be in real trouble. We must always touch base with what's happening in the local community. I'll very quickly tell you, try to answer this question that's been posed. If we look at the split of what actually happens in the spend, about 10 to 15% of the spend is in the area of support services. I hate the term back office because it's not back office, it's supporting people. Asset management, which is infrastructure, accounts for about 35% of the spend. The frontline services, which are education and social services and related services, account for 50 to 55% of the spend. And that's a split that applies across most public services. In the work that's been done so far, the areas that are most promising are undoubtedly when local authorities get together with commitment in relation to commissioning. Where that works, you do drive down the costs and you do improve the efficiency. and you do have control of the delivery through the contract. And that applies to both children's services and adult services and learning disability services. In the area of waste management, there are distinct advantages in working together. At the present time, there is a formal binding inter-authority agreement involving 5 local authorities in the Clyde Valley area. It's called the Clyde Valley Waste Management Initiative. It's on track. It's in the European Journal, the OJEU now. It is well ahead in terms of its planning and regulation to be in place ahead of the proposed landfill ban. I consider that a real success. They've had 5 authorities realising that landfill is a huge problem area. Working together, we can actually do something to solve it. So that's an example. We also know in the area of support services, most recently, that 4 local authorities are actually working on a revised management service for their support services, and that's to do with, and that's a project that's actually being led by the private sector partner, and that's handling all the data of that 10 to 15% that I mentioned for these local authorities. So I would say that we're beginning to see green shoots, and there's still lots to be done, but I think we've got some clear evidence where people have stuck at it, and that's work that's taken maybe 2.5 years to come to maturity, that we can actually work together.
Can I, before I take Stuart McMillan back in, you're describing a situation, Sir John, where basically in some of these cases, these things have been driven by the timescales because certain things are almost inevitable, particularly in terms of waste. However, as has been said previously by yourself, a lot of the other things that were suggested in the Clyde Valley Partnership have been parked at this moment in time. Now, what I am aware of what we're doing here today is we're talking a lot about the major success stories that there are, but there have been a huge amount of failure in terms of either the parking of things left till tomorrow, or in some cases in parts of the country where schemes have been abandoned. Now, I'm quite happy to talk about success, that's grand, but at the end of the day, we are still seeing as a committee and in the country as a whole, situations where shared services have been talked about for a very long time, but have never come to fruition. So
I was asked to give examples of successes, so I gave them. I think I absolutely agree with you. There have been many instances where things have been parked. In many cases, the reason why they've been parked is actually not so much to do with the programme in relation to progressing in sharing services, but actually political uncertainty. So that the politics of this is very, very important. You know, it's the idea that you actually give up control of your own system is a sensitive area, and you know that very well.
I understand that. In terms of the situation that we have at this moment in time in terms of the sharing of good practice, which often doesn't happen, I'm really interested in what Dr. Black had to say in his submission to the committee round about a safe space for learning and knowledge. Sometimes I feel that there's an unwillingness to share good practice in many places. A case of I'm not letting them steal my ideas type of situation. I wonder if you could maybe expand on your idea for a safe space for learning and knowledge, which intrigues and excites me, Dr. Black.
Thank you for that opportunity. Reflecting on many years in public life, which I've enjoyed, I think by and large in Scotland we haven't been nearly good enough to ferret out, to have an appetite for finding out what really works well in different parts of Scotland, to learn and understand about it, and then to transport and develop that in other places. And I think it's an area where we still have a lot of unfulfilled opportunity. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And what we see in Scotland, and you can dip into a myriad of Audit Scotland reports for information about this, is examples of good practice peppered throughout the reports. But it seems to be there's no systematic way of developing a deeper understanding of that, taking that knowledge in and thinking about what lessons are involved here for taking this elsewhere. And if I may say so, it's an issue for elected representatives as well, who cannot be expert in all the complex fields of public service delivery. A way of actually helping them to understand what is happening really well in parts of Scotland, and almost to say to people in the Moan Patch, can we not have some of that stuff? You know? And in a sense provide a degree of authorization and challenge to try and encourage innovation to happen more swiftly in other parts of Scotland. So that's one theme. The second theme is that, as John has eloquently described, so much of what is going on in Scotland at the moment is not going on in the old stovepipes of local government or the health service or the police service. It's being joined up. And out of partnership working, there are some really good initiatives developing across Scotland. But where's a place where we can actually arrange for people to sit down together and say, the partnership in the west of Scotland between the police and the local authority in terms of community safety, which I think is going really rather well from my limited understanding of it. Where's a place where we can help elected representatives to understand that well and be impatient in their own patch to see some of that stuff being done there? So I do think there is something about bringing all of that together. And I also think it's important, just as I talked about the old-fashioned stovepipes, which you think vertically of the NHS, the different floors in the building, where you have, the leadership forum at the top, chaired by very well by Sir Peter Housden, and various other initiatives, but they don't connect necessarily as well as they should. And there is something about bringing in the voluntary sector and, where appropriate, the private sector into these discussions. And we don't have anywhere in Scotland, I think, a single powerful place where we can do that kind of sharing of knowledge and understanding, and do it in a way which is tolerant of different points of view, allows different experiences to be expressed, but does it with a degree of structure to it so that the learning can be captured and taken forward. That may sound a bit abstract, but there is a need for that in Scotland, I think. And back right to where I started from on the small government issue. Scotland should be able to do that stuff really, really well. I think it's almost a bit like a low-hanging fruit. It would take a bit of work, but we could do it, and we could do a lot better than we do at the moment.
Supplementary from John Wilson, then back to Stuart McMillan. We seem to be drifting, gentlemen, which is always the case when we have eminent witnesses, and I think we need to get back on track. So briefly, John Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. It was partly to try and concentrate on the questions I'd agreed to ask earlier, but it's really in terms of Sir John's comments, in terms of the Clyde Valley review. Now, my understanding is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong in my assumption of this, is it was to bring 8 local authorities together to try and come up with a common direction, common objective, and shared service delivery. Now, what you've given examples of is you've said 5 local authorities have signed up to a shared waste management process. You've got 4 local authorities out of the 8 have signed up to revised management services for those 4 authorities. Is this the Clyde Valley Review a pick and mix for local authorities? That local authorities, out of the 8 authorities, they can actually dip in and dip out when they don't think the services that are going to be delivered suit their needs. Because, as I said, if that's the approach, because you've given good examples of Stirling and Clackmannanshire working together, some of the Lothian authorities working together, but are we seeing the Clyde Valley Review ending up being a pick and mix, and out of the 8 authorities, in one example, the revised management services, only 50% of these authorities actually buying into that. And there is another example that I know from the early days of the Clyde Valley Review is IT services, where one authority was a leading expert on IT services in terms of local government, but the other 7 authorities refused to buy into that expertise and skills. And we have those skills and expertise within certain local authorities. But as you said earlier, is it the barrier to actually sharing those, the expertise in those local authorities down to unwillingness by either the civil leadership of the local authorities or the political leadership of those authorities?
Chair, I would give a very short answer to that, because I could give a very long answer to it, and lots of painful experiences would then emerge, and I don't want that to happen. Very briefly, I was not in a position to compel. That was not in the remit. The remit was a voluntary coming together to review and come up with possible ways forward, which is what happened in the year that I did it. I left behind a very clear roadmap, but it was always, because that's the nature of local government, it was always at the choice of the members of that consortium to decide which projects they would buy into and not. So you're correct. It was not that the review actually came up with a prescription which had to be followed. I think I wouldn't have got past meeting 1 if I'd done that. So I consider, although people have gone their own way, we actually have made some progress as well. But I hope it's clear that's the way in which that's what I was asked to do, and I did it. I think I made a point at the very beginning, which is that I think perhaps that review came a little early in the evolution of the political state that we're in at the moment. If it had come later on, I think we might have had a better chance of getting more buy-in. I still think it was worth doing.
Thank you very much. Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Convener. Just regarding the shared services, and following on from that discussion there, with the shared services and the working together, this may be an unfair question to pose, Sir John, but I'll pose it nonetheless. You can answer it or disregard it. Just in terms of the Clyde Valley Review, with the smaller local authorities, was there a sense of, well, for want of a better word, of intimidation due to the number of kind of larger local authorities who are actually involved in that? So was there maybe too much of a kind of a conflict or mix in terms of between the larger and the smaller authorities?
People, in response, Chair, again, very briefly, at the beginning, people talked in that way, about the problems that might be associated with doing it. All I can say is that everybody kept to their commitment. They would nominate their bright people, the people who knew all about the services, the people who were supplying information to Bob and his colleagues in auditing, the people who were looking at the future in terms of budgets and what might have to be controlled. These people came from all over that area. So there was no constraint by leaders or other members of these councils to say, well, we're not putting anybody in there. So that all worked very well. But I think we're talking about local authorities with different local government political priorities and objectives, and they will always be looking over their shoulder saying, how's this going to affect us? It might be better for us in Inverclyde to start working with the 3 Ayrshires than working with these guys. So that kind of reflection was going on, but the issue was, let's make a start at this, see how far it goes, and see what happens. That's what we did.
Could I offer a thought about that?
Dr. Black.
To come away from an individual example, whether it's in the west of Scotland or whatever, as we go forward with shared services, it's really important that we try and get everybody marching in step. if, for example, you have, let's say, one body which has actually moved forward on its IT strategy and has made the commitment to a certain contractual relationship, a certain relationships in terms of service provision. They all had a business case for that, and they will be assuming certain benefits. So let's say that is off and running. And then a few years later, we say, well, let's set up a shared service contract here with a number of other bodies. If I was the chief executive of the first body, I would say, well, hold on a minute, we've got a business plan in place, we're getting the savings driven through. By all means, we are willing to talk to you about how we might actually put this onto a shared service basis, but it would be uneconomical, it would not be best value for us as an individual authority or board or whatever to pull out of that contract that we've entered into. And therefore, the answer has to be to come around us. Now, to the outside world, that might appear a bit like the Big Brother kind of approach, but quite often there'll be sound business reasons why it's difficult for public bodies to come together like this. And I think we need to recognise and respect that, and that is why a strategic approach is really, really important. As one of the things about what I said very much earlier, you know, John is implying we should start these kind of initiatives earlier on a more strategic basis many years ago, because we're struggling with that, I think, now.
Supplementaries from Jamie McGregor and then John Pentland. I'm keen to ensure that we talk about Strand 1 and 2 and the public impact of all of this. So Jamie, very briefly, please.
Question on preventative spending, if that's all right.
I think we'll come back to that in a
Like,
little while. John Pentland, if it's a supplementary.
Mr Black, in your submission you talk about pressures on public services, and do you think perhaps some of the shared services would probably have alleviated some of those pressures, or do you think it's perhaps that these pressures are there because of the declining share for local government from Scotland's, from the Scottish Government's expenditure?
I think those, if I may say so, are two separate questions. I think undoubtedly a move towards shared services at an earlier stage, well planned strategically, would have generated significantly greater efficiency savings than has so far been achieved. So as I think we're all recognising, progress has been slow. So the answer to that is yes, if we should have moved on this area earlier, but for all the reasons that I think we're recognising, it's been difficult to do that. With regard to funding from central government, I think that, quite frankly, Mr. Bent, is purely a policy matter on which I'm not really qualified to speak, I don't think.
Thank you. Stuart Stevenson, you have some questions around about Strand 1 and 2 of our inquiry.
Thank you very much. Let me just, based on what we've heard so far, try and elicit a kind of yes-no answer to something I'm just about to ask. It seems in business that we would take the attitude it's better to decide a question without debating it than it is to debate a question without deciding it. On the basis of what I've been hearing this morning, it appears the opposite might be true in public service. Is that my being grossly unfair, or has that got something in it?
That's a Black question.
Well, thank you for that. You owe me one. No, seriously. I think in there is a serious issue, and the serious issue is in the public sector, it's really, really important that we think strategically about the direction of travel, and that we test out different models of service delivery before we commit, because you can pay a very high price if you get things wrong. And the public policy of Scotland over the last 10 to 12 years, and I've spoken out about it fairly unreservedly, has got quite a number of examples of policies that were pushed through very quickly for understandable reasons because people wanted to see results. Where in reflection, one might have said, well, perhaps I should have tested this out in a smaller scale first of all before we committed. So I am very much in favour of encouraging everyone in the public sector, whether it's central government, local government, whatever, to think seriously about doing testing out new policy initiatives before committing significant resources. which is a kind of a halfway house.
I suppose that's the old saying, you only find oil if you drill enough dry holes. Just picking up specifically then to try and look at partnership and joint working and whether the community planning partnerships are making a sensible and useful contribution. Now, in the RSE submission at 27, you specifically say it's essential if the CPPs are to be the agents of change, that their authority is strengthened. Now, the if the CPPs are to be agents of change, I think is kind of the key. Are you yet convinced either way whether they can be, should be, or will be?
If we take the example of the integration of health and social care in the delivery of health and social care for older people and taking account of the demographic changes that I've mentioned before. This is now a hugely challenging issue. We know it's going to happen. We know it's there. The only way that that can be delivered is by agreement and partnership between the local authorities and the health boards. And that should happen through the community planning partnerships, in my view. It's going to happen if we're going to deliver these things together and manage the money. Because the way in which, and this is, I'm second guessing in a way what comes back from the consultation in relation to the government's proposals on this, but I'd be surprised if it is not the case that there is going to have to be a much more common way in which we address the projected costs and the expenditure and the delivery. And that's going to be a joint process, and unless we have a means by which we can bring local authorities and health boards together to do that, it's not going to happen. But it is going to happen because it will be government policy. Community partnerships seem to me to be the way to do that. That's why I think we've got that part in there.
You have quite specifically said, if they're to be agents of change, authority needs to be strengthened. Is that implicitly saying, at the moment, they are not agents for change, and therefore whether they've been successful or adding value is still, the jury's out?
I think looking back, you could say that they haven't been as productive as agents of change as I would have hoped them to be. If we're going to make the best use of them, and we have to remember that we've got the police force and the fire services in these community planning partnerships as well.
Yep.
The fire service and the police force are now completely reorganised. It's likely we're going to see substantial reform, I think, in local authorities. The nexus is going to be something like a community planning partnership. That's my own personal view. I'm not speaking on behalf of all the fellows who wrote that paper.
So if we didn't have them, we'd have to have something very like them.
So, yes.
Yeah. Well, moving to Dr. Black at 5 on partnership working, not specifically talking, I think, about CPPs at that point, but nonetheless, picking up on the Christie Commission, you're making the point, Audit Scotland reports over the years have highlighted the mixed performance of partnerships on the ground, and then you give a list of 8 bullet points that are necessary. How many of those bullet points do you think actually are in the system that is community planning partnerships? Or are we starting with a blank sheet of paper where your 8 bullet points need to be added?
We're certainly not starting with a blank sheet of paper, and I think one of the common findings from all the work that Audit Scotland has done in that, as I say, I'm speaking now personally and privately on the basis of previous career. One of the common themes that came out of that was the enormous diversity and difference that existed across Scotland in how partnerships organised themselves and how they went about their business. But I think it's important to say, quite frankly, that in far too many areas we were finding that the partnerships were not contributing the value that we might have expected to see in terms of improving the quality of service delivery, getting costs down and quality up. And the Audit Scotland website has got many, many examples of that. We looked at the community health partnerships in 2011, and we found some, serious issues in there around the need for significant improvement in financial scrutiny and performance monitoring, for example. Quite a basic issue around resources. And then just a year ago, in March 2012, we did a report on the commissioning of social care. And again, we found that the quality of the commissioning that was going on out of the partnership wasn't really up to standard in quite large parts of Scotland. But at the same time, as John has been describing, there are parts of Scotland that are starting to do this rather well, and there's some promising developments there. We need to learn from that quickly and encourage and require others in other parts of the country to adopt the best practice which is coming through.
You paragraph 9 in your contribution, where you talk about benchmarking, again, the context is in relation to the Scottish Commission on Resources and Performance, but I take it as being of more general applicability. Are you therefore saying to us, because you said diversity, I got the sense that you thought diversity was good, because of course the needs of the Western Isles, Orkney and Shetland are quite different from the needs of central Glasgow. I got that sense. But to what extent is benchmarking, the Solus initiative, which has been referred to previously, going to really help? And Sir John, I think in particular, previously talking about data, I think was essentially addressing the issue of the difficulty of comparison because it's not normalised data. Where do we go from here, and how do partnerships help make the contribution to this? And in specific terms, how do we help community planning partnerships pick all that quite big, quite intellectual stuff and turn it into something that's actually deliverable?
I think I mentioned in my note, good benchmarking is hard to do. It takes a lot of time and investment. Proof positive of that is the length of time it has taken for local government with the improvement service to reach a point where they actually have a set of indicators that everyone has signed up to, where the data is being cleaned out so we can actually come to some useful conclusions about it. So that's the first thing. It's hard to do. If it was easy to do, again, it would be done a long time ago. And if I may just develop that theme a little more, it's really, really important that the data that comes out of a benchmarking exercise is interpreted well. So, for example, let's take the case of measured educational attainment and the costs of school provision per pupil. Now, the context is quite different in an area of deprivation compared with, let's say, somewhere up in the north of Scotland. And therefore, we need to interpret this data really quite carefully. The risk is, there are two risks. One risk is that, quite frankly, the media and people with an eye for the main chance take one indicator, let's say measured attainment in one local authority area, and conclude that they're a very poor education authority. And therefore, the whole value of the exercise is reduced. People get dispirited by it and say, well, that's the last time we're engaging in anything like that, thank you very much. And the politicians say, well, there's an election coming up in 18 months, well, I've no more of that benchmarking stuff, if you don't mind. I'm speaking very frankly, as I can do now that I'm retired. So these are real issues. And that's why I'm saying we need places and organisations within Scotland where this material is actually organisations which are trusted that can interpret this sort of material well. The second point is it's hard to do because it takes a lot of hard work. It takes a lot of good analytical expertise to do this. And that is really difficult for partnerships to do because their staff are all under huge pressure. And I do think there was an issue there about maybe support from the centre to help people do benchmarking really well. We did a piece of work, as you may recall, on the economic development function, which clearly was devolved to local authorities from Scottish Enterprise, and we produced a report on the partnership working using that as a tracer condition. And we found in remarkably many parts of Scotland, they didn't have the basic data together, which enabled them to understand the nature of the local economy and design their interventions. Because it's a skilled thing to do, you know. Local economic analysis is a skilled thing to do. So there are issues in there about enabling partnerships to work better, enabling and supporting partnerships to work better. And I don't think we do enough of that.
Thank you. One final question, Stuart.
I'm just going to pick up on that, and I'm going to put a proposition to you, which you can, of course, fundamentally disagree with. Benchmarking you've talked about in terms of its use externally, essentially as others making judgments about what's going on. Whereas my personal experience of view is that benchmarking is really about the value derived internally by helping organisations identify good practice elsewhere that they want to steal. If the focus in benchmarking were to be external, does that carry with it the very real risk of driving down preparedness to take risks because of the fear of external scrutiny and comment? Whereas if its focus is internal, then it minimises risk and encourages good behaviour change, because of course you can copy other success stories and have a story to tell internally in yourself and to others. I mean, it just seems to me benchmarking isn't about another set of metrics for the outside world to tell people. It's really about helping the organisation help itself. Am I unfairly characterising benchmarking, or is that how you see it?
Chairman, can I give an example? This goes way back to when I was asked just before the introduction of the Scottish Parliament to look at the resource formula for the allocation of resources for health. And the reason why I was asked to do that was that there was a growing view that the allocation did not actually take account of the health inequalities across Scotland. And I was asked to address that and come up with a new formula, which is actually still the way in which it's done. The reason I mention it now was we didn't actually go out and ask people what they thought was right or wrong about the issues that should be on the list. What we set out to do, and it's sometimes necessary to do this if you're going to get a practical outcome. I mean, we had a list of about 20 indicators that we could have fed into this formula. The formula would have been totally unworkable with 20 indicators. Actually, what we did was to use 4 indicators. And perhaps this is an admission. It wasn't the top 4 indicators, it was the 4 indicators which would reproduce themselves from year on year. So, and the issue, that took care of a redistribution of resource that also matched where the differences in health inequalities lay. And one of the inequalities which was very important, we also worked into that, which was staringly obvious, was that in remote communities, they're further away from anything else. So the distance factor, and particularly the distance factor in relation to the islands, was added to that process. So we then had something that was a fairly reasonable measure of inequalities and also took account of the particular situation of remote communities. So it took care of remoteness, and that was introduced not instantly in 1 year, but over a period of about 5 years, which enabled a transition to occur. And that is probably the biggest expenditure that the Scottish Government actually makes. Yep. So there's lessons here. You can go into the fine detail of differences and equalities and inequalities, as Bob said, in relation to education. Focusing on 1 or 2 will divert you from the general objective, which is all that government, either nationally or locally, can do, is to make absolutely the best efforts to provide resources that meets the need. And that's what happened.
Thank you. Anne McTaggart, please.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome panel. Good afternoon now. It was a point earlier on, Sir John, you had mentioned, just to pick up on that, in a number of the other areas of work that the committee has noted the disconnect between the centre and ground level of delivery of public services. If such disconnect is endemic, what is the impact of this on public service reform, and in particular the benefit of shared services?
Are you saying that, could you just repeat that again, because I wasn't absolutely clear about the question, the disconnect being?
Between the centre and the ground level.
Between the centre and the ground level?
I think Ms McTaggart is getting to the point of what is happening in terms of on the ground compared with up there in terms of the CPPs, for example.
I think, in a way, Bob has answered or actually drawn attention to some of the work that has been done in that area, and where he thinks that with a continuing process where we set out to actually look at the outcomes in a more systematic way, we could get a better handle on that. But I think that this comes to the nub of the issue of locality and the delivery of service. And it would take too long to go into the discussion at the present time, but I think what you've identified is a pretty important point, because you cannot generalise about localities. There are localities in all parts of Scotland which have individual characteristics. If these individual characteristics, which may be that the ferries don't run frequently enough, that that there are basic problems in terms of the road system or the rail system, which means they can't be directly compared with others, and the citizens find themselves, because of the general formula, in some way, worse off or not faring as well as they should, then there's a feeling of unfairness. That feeling of unfairness will be expressed through the local political system, and you will get some kind of shindig, as we often see with regard, for instance, to ambulance services to remote communities. I don't think I would be in a position to solve all of these problems now, but just to acknowledge, and I don't know what Bob would say, that there are, we have to be very aware that we're providing our services in whatever way, whether it's the police, the fire, the health, or the local authorities in all sorts of different ways, for the benefits of people who live there. It's not just a financial system that we're running. It's actually a system that should be benefiting the public at all levels. And that's a very difficult thing to do. I think you've identified that. Do you want to comment on that?
Just to come at the question slightly differently, I think the Christie Commission was spot on when it put a degree of emphasis upon the importance of effective partnership working at the local level. Because, as John has eloquently said, it's at that level that you have a good understanding of the local problems, and it's at that level that you can cope with the diversity that exists across Scotland. But one of the biggest challenges we're facing is how do you make partnerships effective, given that there are a limited number of busy people delivering services, running local authorities, running health boards with different priorities and interests. And it's a huge challenge which won't be addressed overnight. But I do think it's an issue for this Parliament, if I may say so, to try and think through the accountability of partnerships for what they're doing and how that can best be organised. And if you look back, as I think I mentioned some little time ago, at the large number of Audit Scotland reports that have looked at partnership working, by and large, the messages are pretty challenging about partnerships not working terribly well. And if we're going to take the Christie Commission proposals seriously, we need to find ways of breaking through that and making sure across the whole of Scotland, not just in parts of Scotland where they're doing very well, across the whole of Scotland, we learn from what works well and translate that experience, transfer that knowledge quickly to other parts of the country, and require people to address these issues seriously.
Chair, this is very quick. There was, in the period between 2002 and 2000 and the end of the first decade, although, as Bob has said, not much happened in terms of progress, there was a lot happening in terms of the spending of money. When myself and others came to look at what was the product, what was the benefit of that, it was pretty limited. In fact, very unproductive. So we're not going to make progress just by saying, well, we have a problem, here's a, this is what we're going to spend on it. We have to know what we're spending our money on and what the benefits are going to be.
Thank you for that. Ms McTaggart, you want to come back?
Yeah, really, it's the importance of communities and community representatives and how they play in the process of public service reform. And my last question, sorry for it being a bit muddled up, but it was really about some of the experience that we have sought. There wasn't that many community representatives being represented. In a sense, the community hadn't been advised or sought upon for some of the decisions that had been made. So it was really just to hear your views on the importance of how communities make an impact with the CPPs and the public service reform.
My most recent experience of this was actually not with local authorities, but was when I did the review on providing resources for care of the elderly. And most of the work of that group of people who did it, who went around Scotland, was actually speaking to local people. It wasn't speaking to officials. It wasn't, we did, of course, speak to officials, but we actually were taking soundings on the basic experiences of people who are in severe distress about not knowing how their elderly relative was being looked after. Making 15, 16, 17 phone calls a day, trying to find somebody who knew where this was, when this movement of the bed was going to take place, were they coming back home, who was looking after her. The synthesis of that experience, to me, it really impressed on me a need. It convinced me that a fundamental reform of the way in which we integrate health and social care is not just necessary, it's essential. And people who are receiving the benefit and the families and the carers who are looking after them have got to be informed. And the pathway of care has got to be clear, and it isn't. That's a very blunt answer.
Thank you. I have a number more questions that need to be asked, gentlemen. I know that time is limited, and you've been in the hot seat for quite a while now. If you could just bear with us, and we'll try and finish the session by 12:30. Jamie?
Yes, on preventative spending, which you write about, Sir Robert, in your paper at some length. I think it's a key to lowering costs and providing better services. But you say that when it comes to preventative spending agenda, the data is insufficient. In what aspects is the data insufficient? And do you think this is due to an underlying lack of political will when it comes to preventative spending? And the second part of my question is, you also say there is a need for evidence-based analysis of the programmes and services which contribute most effectively to prevention. So the question is, what should or could the government or Parliament do to produce this?
Perfectly fair question, and a very big one, if I may say so. I'm absolutely certain it's not a lack of will, but I do think that the financial planning and reporting systems of the Scottish Government and how they're considered within this Parliament are still in need of further development. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But the background to this, as I'm sure I don't have to tell the committee, was that the Scottish Government made a significant commitment of about 500 million in the previous financial year to preventative spending, which was widely praised, and it mentioned the three specific funds, which were the Change Fund for Older People Services, the Early Years and Early Intervention Change Fund, and the Reducing Reoffending Change Fund. So you could identify where that was going. However, if you look at the big numbers of public spending, the spending doesn't move terribly much year on year in terms of the big numbers between one service and another service, or one part of the public sector and another part of the public sector. There is a continuing improvement in the quality of information that is provided to the Finance Committee and the Parliament about the spend and where it occurs. but there is still a significant disconnect between the Scotland Performance Framework, which is the ambition for where they want to go in terms of outcome, and what services are contributing to those outcomes, and within those services, which spend is taking place that will actually reduce the need for services further down the line and improve the quality, the quality of life of people out there. So it's really difficult to do. And in other places, I've given the example of the so-called services that are free at the point of delivery. And I've been traduced in some places by being accused of being against services which are free at the point of delivery. And nothing could be further from the truth. We've got to recognise that free eye testing actually can be construed as preventative spending, because as we know, medical conditions can be detected very early. You can even go as far as to say that aspects of the new contract for GPs, which was introduced quite a number of years ago without adequate thought to the performance framework, but the NHS has been catching up on that, because of some of the screening work which is now done in GP surgeries. There's evidence that you can attribute that spend, the new GP contract, to a reduction in the incidence of strokes, for example. That's at another extreme end of the spectrum. So we just need to get much smarter and sharper at thinking through why we're spending the money we are, what we expect the outcomes to be, and analysing whether or not we're getting those outcomes and whether that spending can be attributed to those outcomes. A tall order, but we've got to do more of that kind of work than we've done in the past, in my opinion.
Sir John, do you want to add anything to that?
Very briefly, I agree with what Bob has said, and I actually see, I put this point to an earlier meeting I attended of the Finance Committee, and I would put it to this committee. I think policy changes are, for very genuine reasons, introduced by government. The follow-through of what happens as a consequence of these policy changes is not followed through except when somebody chooses to question it, or when Bob's figures show that what's supposed to be happening is not happening. I think there is, I would have liked to have seen more of a continuous review process within the committee structure of the Scottish Parliament. That's putting it back to you, Chairman, in a way. But I do think that I think the work you're doing on this particular topic is absolutely fundamentally important. I hope it doesn't peter out, because you write the report, what happens to the report? It's like you asking me, you've done a study, what's come out of your study?
I think in terms of the effort that's been put in, and this is strand 3 of the inquiry, I don't think very many of us would sit and watch it peter out, to be honest with you. I hope not anyway, Sir John. John Pentland, please.
So, John, can I thank you for that comment, because it's certainly something that, you've certainly been asking, that, we need to try and scrutinise the budget, from all the way through. And I'm just wondering if I could maybe ask a question. Do you think that we in Scotland need the equivalent of the Office of Budget Responsibility?
I'm not sure is my answer to that, because I'm not. I don't want to. I mean, sometimes I listen to Newsnight and I wonder what that particular organisation is actually doing. So I couldn't give it a full, wholehearted endorsement. Over to you, Bob.
It's in the same boat, Sir John. Dr. Black.
If I may try and sort of give a reasonably full answer to that. Clearly, we're in a totally different spending environment, point one. Point two, the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government is going to accrue to itself in very short order new tax-raising powers, which will be a significant change. The Scottish Government has actually established Revenue Scotland to think about some of these things. And certainly within the Scottish Government, there's been a strengthening over the years of the finance function and the Treasury function, which I think is to be commended. It's something that personally, over years, I thought was necessary. That will help. We've got to recognise, however, that the team in the Scottish Government, which does the financial analysis, has a prime responsibility to the Scottish ministers, to the government of the day, and that's entirely appropriate. The idea behind the Office of Government Responsibility was to actually have an external body which would help set the scene for the whole debate around public spending by being independent of government and have a degree of integrity and expertise in that area. And there is some value in that also, I think. However, Scotland is a small country, and it's all too easy, and we can see it across many aspects of public life, that you end up with quite a fragmented response, lots of small units. And if we were going to move in the direction of creating some kind of a capacity there, it comes back to some of the thoughts I've been sharing with the committee earlier around creating one entity which can do really good analysis across the whole of public spending, because we can't afford to have lots of different units. And skills are actually very scarce in the ground to get really good people to do this kind of stuff. So there is a case, I think, for the Parliament to consider seriously whether we need to strengthen that independent analysis, not only of the public finances, but also of issues like the productivity and the performance agenda, which we've been talking about this morning, because it's the same type of skills that you need. So not an office of, I've forgotten the title of them. Not an OBR, but taking a leaf from their book and creating our own novel, so to speak, our own storybook.
Okay. Mr. Pentland, have you got?
Very quickly, Chair, then I'll put these two questions into one. Obviously, times have been challenging for local authorities over recent years, and have you a view or an opinion on if local authorities have been successful in developing new ways in recent years to meet these challenges? And what do you believe should be the driver, the primary goal for developing these new ways?
Short answer to that, Convener, is I think local authorities and indeed the whole of the public sector have managed their way through the last few years of financial retrenchment remarkably well. As the committee knows only too well, the challenge started when the government of the day imposed top-down efficiency targets. And whilst it was difficult for Audit Scotland to provide, strong audited numbers on that, there was enough information around to indicate that local authorities and health boards and other public bodies did remarkably well in actually driving down the cost and still maintaining the services. So has local government, or indeed the rest of the public sector, if I may say so, done well? Yes, I think it has. But that doesn't mean that there aren't great opportunities for improvement going forward.
But also, Chairman, we haven't really seen, we're only about halfway through this series of savings targets at government level. We're only just beginning to see these things biting at local. And I think the initial reaction of local authorities has been, as Bob has said, I think it has been successful, but they're now faced with even greater challenges, and therefore the work of this committee and giving thought to how we are going to plan that into the future is absolutely crucial.
John Wilson, please.
Thank you, Convener. It's just to follow on from that, we do, and it's looking at how we deliver shared services. And we've spoken earlier about some of the barriers facing local authorities. What more do you think the Scottish Government or this Parliament could do to promote shared services and the delivery of those shared services throughout Scotland? Do you have any views on how we could actually deliver those services and overcome some of the barriers that currently exist?
Sir John?
I some time ago, at the beginning of this, I said I had a feeling that there would be a more, if you like, directed, focused approach by the Scottish Government in the not too distant future. I think that will happen. What happened with the coming together of the police service and fire and rescue was a clear example of government taking a fundamental approach to the issue of delivering these two services. And I think that I wouldn't be surprised if in the next, and it will take a little time yet, the next 4 or 5 years, we will see major changes in the reform of public service delivery. Exactly what shape that will take, I'm not quite sure. But I think on the one hand, the pressures are going to be continuing on public services, but on the other, I think we're becoming much more sophisticated and much more skilled in the way in which we examine that and the way in which savings can be made. And I think I've already indicated that I think if you get the right balance of integration between health and social care, we will make a lot better use of that money for the good of the older people of Scotland. So I think it can be done. I think it will be done. I think it's a bit premature to guess exactly what will be done, but I think fairly strong action will be taken. That's just my guess.
I think we, in Scotland, using the collective we, if I may, we need to carry on doing more of what we're doing, which is working well. And by that, I'm thinking particularly of the initiatives coming out of government around shared procurement, changing the rules of the game for NHS national services to allow them to get out there with confidence and speak with local authorities about developing shared services for some of the support functions. That's very good. The work that I think the Scottish Futures Trust has initiated around capital projects planning and management is good. I mean, there are different views about the added value of that, but nevertheless the direction of travel has to be right, where you have got centres of expertise that are really skilled in procuring capital projects and so on. That direction of travel is really good. So when I say do more of that, and I think this relates to partnership working, I think the more we can do to develop in our relatively small country centres of expertise that can help the public sector do this stuff better, the better for Scotland as a whole. I think we should be doing that. And if you come back to the commissioning of social care services, there was quite a challenging report came out from Audit Scotland last spring, and that was one of the last ones done in my watch, actually, around some really quite significant weaknesses in the commissioning of care services across Scotland. And we've got to recognise the reality that it's really difficult for each and every individual local authority or partnership to think through best practice in that area. And therefore, providing expertise from across the whole of government to help that happen would be really, really useful, I think.
Responses in relation to, you've mentioned health and social care for older people and looking at how we deliver that service and look at best practice. Do you think there are any areas that we have to have national shared services? And would the health and social care for older people be one of these areas where you may see, instead of being delivered locally within partnership at a local health board level or a local authority level, that we should be moving towards a national delivery mechanism to ensure that we have uniformity throughout Scotland and how these services are being delivered at a local level?
Gentlemen, last question and last answers, please. Thank you.
We could discuss that item for quite some time, and we don't have that much time. I personally feel that the measures that are being looked at the present time, in terms of those that were put forward by Nicola Sturgeon when she was Minister for Health, deal with the main issues. They deal with the responsibility for delivery. They deal with the absolute priority of delivering the service that is needed to the individuals and their families, and it deals with the question of how the money is actually distributed and how the money is actually budgeted for and delivered. If we go along these lines, and I don't know what the outcome of this consultation is going to be, I think we'll be on the right road. I think I'm not saying that we should move towards a national set of measures at the moment, because I happen to know that there are areas in Scotland where this works magnificently. If there are areas in Scotland where it really does work very well, with the teams working together, both of the GPs that we haven't mentioned very much, the GPs are not central enough in that process at the moment, The GPs, the hospital services, the acute services, the local services are actually focused in delivering the appropriate care at the best price, using tariffs for the people of their communities. And if we can cascade that out, and I think Bob is saying cascade out the best practice, you will make a great deal of progress. If we launch into a completely new system, it's again going to take you a long time to get it right.
Yeah, I would absolutely heartily endorse what John's just said, and just add one further final thought. It is a case of horses for courses. It is, I think, right, for example, that there should be national procurement of things like energy contracts and so on across the whole of the public service. But it is rather different when you get into commissioning the health and social care and the community services, where we're back to the issue of diversity and difference. But having said that, making sure that partnerships are supported with the right skills and expertise to do that well in the local area according to local needs and priorities is really, really important, and I think we need to do more of that.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for your time this morning. I have a number of questions that I haven't asked today, and I know that other colleagues are the same. And quite frankly, we could have probably sat here all afternoon and probed your knowledge. It may well be, gentlemen, that we might invite you back again during the course of this inquiry. Maybe you can give us some top tips in terms of where we're at. And we'd certainly be interested to hear about more of your thinking, particularly around about the Royal Societies reaping the benefits of a digital Scotland. And I have to say that I'm enthralled by Dr. Black's suggestion of a safe space for learning. Thank you. I hope that this hasn't been too long a session for you. We may ask you to come back again. Many thanks. Can I suspend and go into private session, please?